My mother got pregnant at 55, and that decision ruined every life around her, including mine. She never told us she had gone through IVF. By the time we found out, her belly was already starting to show. The first person to panic wasn't me or my father. It was my sister-in-law, Susan. She grabbed my arm that same night and whispered that a pregnancy at Mom's age was extremely dangerous. She said she was scared for Mom's life and begged me to talk some sense into her. I was a professional doula. If anyone could convince Mom to stop, it was me. When I tried, Mom slapped me so hard my mouth went numb. She screamed that I was heartless, that she and Dad were finally blessed with a child in their later years, and that instead of being happy, I wanted to take that blessing away. My father backed her up, warning me that if I ever mentioned abortion again, I wouldn't get a single dollar from the relocation payout they were expecting. Susan watched the whole thing quietly. The next day, she changed her tune completely. She started showing up every morning with soup, stews, and heavy broths meant to nourish the baby. She hovered around Mom like the perfect daughter-in-law, spoon-feeding her oily food, and insisting she stay in bed all day. Susan said walking was dangerous and exercise could harm the fetus. Mom believed every word. In the family group chat, she praised Susan non-stop and used me as an example of what an ungrateful daughter looked like. I tried to warn them that excessive weight gain and no movement would make labor dangerous. Susan laughed it off. She said eating more meant better nutrition and rest meant safety. Mom told me I was jealous and didn't know what I was talking about, even though childbirth was literally my profession. That pregnancy ended with my mother losing control of her body on the delivery table, a baby that never took a breath, and Susan sobbing that I was useless for failing to save my own brother's life. Mom believed her. A few days later, she lured me to the roof of an empty high-rise and pushed me off. When I opened my eyes, I was back in that familiar bedroom. My mother lay on the bed, her belly round and heavy. Susan stood beside her, holding a bowl of pig trotter soup and smiling sweetly. Susan says you should come into the delivery room with me, Mom said. I stared at the oil floating on the surface of the soup, at my mother's swollen body, and realized I had been given another chance. I burst into tears. I can't, I said, my voice shaking. I lost a patient today. Massive hemorrhage. She died during surgery, and the hospital suspended me. Susan, you're the most devoted one. You'll go into the delivery room with Mom, right? Susan's smile froze. Her hand paused midair, the spoon hovering above the bowl. What are you saying? She asked carefully. You're the professional. How can you push your own mother's delivery onto someone else? Mom's eyes turned cold immediately. I recognized that look. In my past life, every sentence Susan spoke had quietly turned Mom against me. This time, I kept my head down and wiped my eyes. It's not that I don't want to help, I said. I'm not allowed to. The family of that patient is suing me. They say she died because she was too old and too overweight, and they're blaming me for everything. Mom's chewing slowed. Her fingers brushed the soft folds at her waist. The pork pie in her hand suddenly didn't look as appealing. Susan shot her a look and quickly cut in. Enough. That woman died because Jane isn't competent. Don't listen to her excuses. Mom relaxed and took another bite. Then she sneered at me. With your skill level, I wouldn't dare let you near me anyway. Susan will stay with me. I finally let out a quiet breath. Susan didn't notice. Her face had already gone stiff. After Mom finished the soup, Susan brought out more food. Nuts. 2 large pieces of durian. Meat pies stuffed with pork and scallions. Mom ate until her face shone with grease. While she was distracted, I gently suggested again that Susan be the one to accompany her during delivery. Susan dragged me into the kitchen the moment Mom wasn't listening. Her grip was tight, her voice low and frantic. Jane, I'm scared, she whispered. Why don't you talk to Mom? Suggest that Dad go in with her instead. It was always like this. Susan never wanted to be the one to say the hard things. She wanted me to speak up, take the blame, and let her remain the favorite. I smiled and shook my head. Dad doesn't know anything about childbirth. Mom trusts you the most. I don't dare say another word. Susan looked like an ant trapped on a hot pan. I ignored her and opened the refrigerator. It was packed with ribs, pork belly, and containers of fresh lard, all labeled with sticky notes in Susan's handwriting. I took an apple and bit into it. Don't worry, I said lightly. With how well you fed her, Mom will definitely have the strength for a smooth delivery. Susan's face went pale. Before I finished the apple, she shoved me out the door, saying Mom needed quiet. I didn't argue. I wanted to be as far away from that house as possible. Back at my dorm, I called my supervisor and officially requested leave. I told her that if my family called looking for me, she should say I was under suspension for a serious mistake at work. The next morning, my phone rang non-stop. Jane, my father shouted the moment I answered. Your mother is in labor. Get to the hospital now. I took my time responding. I'm in court. The lawsuit from that hemorrhage case. How can you deal with your own mess at a time like this, he yelled. The doctors say your mother has dangerously high blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol. It's very risky. When are you coming? I'm just a suspended doula, I said calmly. You should listen to the doctors. Dad hesitated. The doctor says a C-section is safest, but Susan says surgery is bad. I closed my eyes. In my past life, that exact sentence had sealed my fate. This time, I refused to be dragged into it. You're the head of the family, I said. Listen to whoever you trust. Then I hung up. I made myself a cup of coffee, took a long shower, and turned on the TV. I told myself I was done interfering. Whatever happened next would be the result of their own choices. Not long after, my phone buzzed with video clips from the man I had hired to linger outside the delivery room. I watched calmly as my father paced the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. My brother Paul sat in a plastic chair, slouched over his phone, completely absorbed in a game. Not once did he look up toward the delivery room. The doors suddenly flew open. Susan stumbled out, her face streaked with tears. She shoved her hands toward my father, trembling. She's still not delivered, she cried. She's in so much pain she bit me until I bled. Where is Jane? Why isn't she here to take over? I can't do this anymore. Dad stiffened. Jane is in court, he said, and without another word, he pushed Susan back toward the delivery room. She turned desperately to Paul, but he didn't even glance up from his screen. I let out a quiet laugh. Let her experience what I had endured. A nurse came out soon after, her expression tight. She told Dad that Mom's blood pressure was climbing dangerously fast. She pleaded with him to at least approve an epidural if they refused surgery. Dad hesitated. My daughter-in-law says an epidural lowers a baby's intelligence, he said. Please, just help her endure it naturally. The nurse stared at him in disbelief. Sir, epidurals are safe and commonly used. Dad waved her away. It's not about money. We have money. That's why we're having another child. I shook my head as I watched. He didn't realize that the so-called fortune he kept boasting about was barely enough to support one more life. That was exactly why Susan didn't want this baby to survive. 10 minutes later, Susan ran out again. Her hair was a mess, her clothes smeared with filth. Even through the screen, I could imagine the smell. She tried calling me over and over. When I didn't answer, she broke down completely, throwing her phone and screaming that her hair had been ripped out and her clothes ruined. Then she stormed down the hallway. Dad kicked Paul's chair. Go after your wife. If she leaves, what happens to your mother? Paul followed her reluctantly, still holding his phone. In the stairwell, Susan suddenly turned on him, scratching his face. Are you even human? She screamed. You're making me go back in there. Paul rubbed his cheek. But if you leave and Dad agrees to surgery, what then? You said if we held out, she'd have a hard labor and the baby wouldn't make it. Susan collapsed against the wall, sobbing. Your mother is like a mad animal. I'm going home. You stay here and make sure they don't do surgery. I've suffered all this for you. If that baby is born, do you think we'll see a cent of that money? How are we supposed to buy a car or a house for our son? Then she cursed my name, her voice sharp with hatred. She complained that if I had convinced Mom to abort earlier, she wouldn't have spent 10 months serving her, force-feeding her greasy food just to guarantee a difficult labor. She said she planned to blame everything on me, but now I was conveniently suspended. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Hearing it out loud made my stomach turn. I saved the video. Inside the delivery room, things were falling apart. Mom was exhausted and finally screaming for pain relief. With Susan gone and Mom threatening to divorce him if he didn't sign, Dad caved and approved the epidural. But it was too late. The doctor rushed out again, saying the baby was in distress and an emergency C-section was necessary. Paul tried to block it, repeating everything Susan had drilled into him about immunity and anesthesia. For once, Dad didn't hesitate. He signed. The baby was born alive. A boy. But he didn't cry. He was rushed straight to the neonatal intensive care unit. That was my cue. I changed clothes and headed to the hospital, arriving just as my mother was being wheeled out of surgery. Her face was gray, her body drenched in sweat, the smell of labor still clinging to her. I grabbed my father's arm and started crying. How did this happen? I asked. A blunt nurse answered before anyone else could. It happened because your sister-in-law blocked pain relief, refused surgery, and then abandoned the patient. If your father hadn't signed, both mother and child would be dead. Dad straightened, clearly proud of himself. Mom was awake enough to hear everything. I sat beside her bed and sobbed softly. Mom, I shouldn't have trusted Susan so much. I said, if she'd agreed to surgery sooner, you wouldn't have suffered like this, and the baby wouldn't be fighting for his life. The nurse returned with test results and frowned. Her blood sugar and cholesterol are dangerously high. I lowered my head. Susan was very devoted. She fed Mom heavy food every day and insisted she stay in bed. The nurse's eyes widened. She's already had a child. She should know better. Doing that to an elderly pregnant patient is incredibly dangerous. Mom's eyelids fluttered. I spoke just loud enough for her to hear. I tried to warn her that eating like that without moving would cause problems, but she didn't listen to me. The nurse leaned closer. Your father keeps saying your family is wealthy. You don't think your sister-in-law did this on purpose so the baby wouldn't survive and take a share of the money, do you? Dad stiffened. Right then, Susan walked in carrying a thermos. She sneered when she saw me. Oh, you finally decided to show up now that everything's over. I met her gaze. You ran away when Mom needed you. You tried to stop the surgery. The baby is in critical condition. If I were you, I'd be too ashamed to come back. She faltered, then quickly opened the thermos. Dad, don't listen to her. I went home to cook for Mom. I cut her off. Mom just had surgery. She can't eat, and even if she could, she shouldn't be eating greasy food. Susan's voice rose sharply. Jane, do you even have a heart? Mom must be starving. She tried to feed Mom anyway. With a sudden burst of strength, Mom knocked the thermos from her hands. Are you trying to kill me? Mom rasped. Get out. Paul rushed in, shouting that I was stirring trouble. I ignored him and told them to take Susan to treat her burns. Dad sighed heavily. Jane, I think we misjudged you. I shook my head gently. Don't say that, Dad. Susan probably meant well. She just didn't know better. Susan stared at me, relief flickering across her face. She didn't realize I wasn't saving her. I was trapping her. In the days that followed, the hospital bills stacked up quickly. The baby remained in the NICU, surrounded by wires and monitors, his tiny chest rising and falling with help from machines. The doctors warned that even if he survived, there could be long-term complications. The first person to lose patience was Paul. He stood in the hallway arguing with my father, his voice low but sharp. This is a bottomless pit, he said. We've already spent so much. Maybe we should stop treatment while we still can. Dad's hand flew across his face. That's your brother you're talking about. I stepped in at just the right moment. Dad, he's a life, I said softly. You spent so much money on IVF, and Mom suffered through so much. We have to try. Paul spun on me. That's easy for you to say. Fine, then use your share of the relocation money to pay for it. I met his eyes without blinking. I don't want the money. The room went quiet. I continued, I'll sign a legal waiver. I'll give up all rights to the family assets. In exchange, I won't be responsible for anyone's care in the future. My parents barely hesitated before signing. They were relieved, thinking they could preserve more money for the baby. Susan looked pleased too, until I slid the same paper toward her and Paul. Susan smirked. We're not heartless like you, Jane. We'll stay and take care of Mom and the baby. I nodded. I'm sure you will. Dad smiled, clearly satisfied. Since you're willing to shoulder that responsibility, we won't rush to buy a school district apartment for your son. The money needs to stay with the baby. Susan's smile vanished. But you promised. Mom, weak but clear-eyed, added coldly, if you hadn't fed me grease and lied about prenatal care, we wouldn't be here. We can't afford both. Susan fainted on the spot. A month later, the baby was finally discharged. He came home fragile and quiet, his cries thin and strained. Susan tried to push me out of the house that day, reminding everyone I had signed away my place in the family. I pretended to be devastated, kissed the baby's forehead, and turned to leave. Dad stopped me. Stay for lunch. While we were talking, Susan's young son, who had just been brought back from her parents' house, suddenly lunged at the baby. The baby screamed. Without hesitation, Mom slapped the boy. If you hurt your uncle, I'm done with you, she snapped. The boy froze, then wailed. Grandma is evil. She hit me. He tugged on Susan's pants and shouted, Mom, you said Grandma was stupid and the baby was bad. You said to make him disappear. Susan rushed to cover his mouth, but it was too late. Mom slapped Susan hard. So all that devotion was fake. I quickly stepped in, putting on a concerned expression. Mom, he's just a child. Susan has taken such good care of you. I needed them together. The story wasn't finished yet. Susan shot me a grateful look. Mom allowed them to stay, but ordered that the grandson be sent away again. Because Mom couldn't produce milk, the baby needed expensive formula. Susan tried to save money by diluting it with water. Mom caught her and nearly threw her out, threatening to cut her out of the will completely. For a while, things were quiet. Susan became the picture of obedience. But when the baby turned 6 months old, he fell sick again. His kidneys began to fail, and the medication wasn't helping. One weekend during Mom's birthday dinner, I noticed something strange. The salt in the kitchen was disappearing far too quickly, even though the doctors had ordered a low-sodium diet. When I asked Mom about it, she was confused. She thought I was mistaken. That night, I installed a small hidden camera in the kitchen. The next evening, my father called me, his voice breaking. "Jane, come home. I know why the baby is sick." I rushed over. Susan was on the floor, her face swollen and red. The footage played silently on the TV. It showed her in the middle of the night, scooping large amounts of salt into the baby's formula before shaking the bottle. Mom screamed. "You said you'd love him like your own. You gave a baby kidney failure." Susan collapsed, sobbing. I was tired. It was a mistake. Mom wanted to call the police, but Paul defended her, insisting she was just careless and kind-hearted. I took out my phone. "Paul, Susan, does this video look familiar?" I played the footage from outside the delivery room. Susan talking about wanting the baby to die so they could keep the money. Susan admitting she fed Mom on purpose to cause a difficult labor. Paul asking how to stop a C-section. The room fell silent. Susan lunged for my phone, but I stepped back. "You planned this before the baby was even born." Mom let out a piercing scream and charged at Susan. They tumbled out into the stairwell, shouting and cursing. Susan finally dropped the act. "You had a baby at your age just to steal our money," she screamed. "I've been a slave in this family. I hope you all rot." Blinded by rage, Mom shoved her. Susan fell down the stairs. There was a sickening sound. She didn't move. Paul ran down screaming her name. Mom kicked the body, refusing to believe it was real. Then my father let out a broken cry. The baby isn't breathing. The stress, the illness, the chaos had overwhelmed him. The baby had died in Dad's arms. Mom froze. She grabbed the baby and ran. By the time we reached the street, something fell from above. A dull thud. It was Mom. She was holding the baby. She had jumped. The funerals passed in a blur. 2 coffins, one far too small, placed side by side. I stood quietly at the edge, dry-eyed, feeling like I was watching the ending of a story that had already been written long ago. After everything was over, my father came to find me. He looked smaller than I remembered, his back bent, his hair almost completely white. He handed me a bank card with trembling hands. $3 million, he said. I sold the apartment. I cut Paul off. "I know I failed you, but I'm still your father. Let me live with you." I stared at the card and didn't take it. "Dad," I said calmly, "you were the one who pushed Mom into IVF. You wanted to prove you were still powerful after the relocation money came in. Susan wanted the baby gone for the money. Paul went along with it. The 3 of you destroyed Mom and that child." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. In another life," I continued, my voice steady, "you all killed me too." He looked at me like I was speaking another language. I pushed the card back into his hand. "Goodbye, Mr. Cook. I'm not your daughter anymore." A few days later, the card arrived in the mail anyway. No note. No explanation. I tried calling him, but the number was disconnected. I never heard from him again. That same afternoon, the hospital held a small ceremony. I was given an award for outstanding professional service, a title translated on the plaque as most beautiful doula. My colleagues applauded. They weren't congratulating me for saving lives. They were congratulating me for surviving my own family and finally walking away. For the first time in both of my lives, I went home alone. And I was free.